Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Good evening, good day, good morning, depending on your time zone. I'm happy to welcome you from all the different parts of the world to our first demo webinar. My name is Irina, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It's really great to see so many of you interested in biGENIUS for big data and data warehouse automation. Now, some of you may have already used the GoToWebinar tool. For the rest, I would like to spend some few words on how to use the panel. First of all, you don't need to worry about accidentally turning on your microphone or camera. You will be muted during the webinar. You can use the panel to ask questions and comment whenever you like. We will come back to your questions in our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded. You will have the chance to download the recording within a couple of days when we're ready.
Do you want to step forward?
I would like to step forward, but maybe you can help me because
yeah. So
for some reason I cannot. Yeah. So here you can see also the panel.
Do you need the next slide?
Let's move to the next slide, please. Yes. So you have already heard Gregor, but please let me present to you our speakers, Gregor Zeiler and Gertjan Fluck. Gertjan is our newest team member. We're very happy that he joined our team because he's already playing a key role in the future of biGENIUS. Gertjan has a strong entrepreneurial spirit and most of all, great passion for driving automation in data analytics. Gertjan is responsible for sales and business development now at biGENIUS, opening new market possibilities for us. And here with us is also Gregor. He's a business intelligence expert with more than, Gregor, allow me to say that, more than 20 years of professional experience in the field.
Yeah, in the course almost 25. Yeah,
almost 25. Okay. In the course of his work, he has collected extensive experience in various industries and also on broad spectrum of technologies. Now, Gregor is responsible for product management of biGENIUS. And today, we all together here with Gertjan and Gregor want to show you the biGENIUS application, explain its lean metadata-based approach to automation, and show you how you can unlock the real potential of your data. So, Gregor, Gertjan, if you're now all set, I would like to give the word to Gertjan. Gertjan, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Irina.
Well, so would you yeah, sorry. Would you tell us who is biGENIUS? Is that you?
No, that's not me. Happily not. We have a long history, and probably for most of the attendees, biGENIUS sounds like new. It did sound new to me a couple of months ago, but the good news is it's not new. It is existing for a pretty long time, for many years, and it's just one of the best kept secrets in the software market. And I'm glad that we will open it up for you right now. So I want to talk a little bit about biGENIUS, who we are, what it is, and then hand over to Gregor for more product-related introduction and a demo of the tool so that you can see what kind of value it will bring for you. So let me see if I can move the slides here. Yeah, biGENIUS is, we have a mother company called Trivades, and Trivades is a consultancy firm in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria mainly, and they used biGENIUS in many of their data warehousing projects, over 200 projects. It's a very mature company with 650 people and a lot of revenue, a lot of customers, and they developed biGENIUS as a tool. They did some acquisitions in the past, and it all resulted in the very stable and the mature product as it is today. So it's used in over 200 projects. More than 60 customers are actually running it today already. And it's just not fair to the rest of the world to hide it from you. So that's why we decided to go out and make the product available everywhere on the globe and work with local partners and so on to make it available for everybody, not only for Trivades customers. So the first thing that we did when I joined a month ago is briefing all the imported analysts. They really much liked what they saw. They were pretty impressed because it was a big surprise for them as well that this was such a mature product already and they never heard about it. So in the near future, you will see biGENIUS appear on all the reports and documentation and in training sessions that all the analysts will give, so that we are one of the markets leader on the part of, well, they call us still data warehouse automation. But that's the background. It's running up for, I think, since 2011 already at customer sites, and it's not a new product, new development, new startup. It's existing. It was just not open for the rest of the world, and that's what we're doing right now. According to the analyst, we fit in the data warehouse automation category. It's a long time that we introduced the name. I was involved in that myself with Gartner's, and it has to do with, let's say, traditional data warehousing. Traditional data warehousing is still very important for all the organizations. It exists for about 50 years or 40 years, I mean, in the late 80s. And we now call it the heartbeat of organizations. Every organization need to have it because you have your applications running, your ERP, CRM, supply chains, HR, finance applications, all structured data. And you want to integrate that to create a one single version of the truth, create data marts, and do reporting analysis based on that data. That is needed, for instance, for giving you competitive advantage, but also for reporting to governance so that you are allowed to pay taxes to them. And we all know that if you pay taxes, that's the only way that you exist. So that's very important to have very much governed and audited and qualified data. So the traditional data warehousing is still very important for organizations. But we also know that when you start data warehouse projects, it's kind of a very, well, bad experience. It takes very long. It is very expensive. You cannot deliver in time, and all these disadvantages of building data warehouses and doing ETL coding and all of that. So that is why 10, 15 years ago, we introduced data warehouse automation. There are a lot of tools in the market, but the real serious ones are all metadata driven so that you can steer by having the metadata in order, everything will be generated for you. And it just results in a better, faster, flexible, maintainable, and cheaper solution. Better because the ETL code, for instance, is generated based on metadata. It's not depending on the one who did coding that for you. And if you have multiple people coding, they do it on their own way. They're all different standards and so on. Even one person can have different coding the day after his bachelor party and on a sunny afternoon. So generating code is a way better idea. It's much faster as well. It's standardized. You can have the documentation out of the box available about your coding. So it is maintainable. And building a data warehouse is one thing. The real headache starts if you have to maintain it, if you have to make changes, adding new sources or change from Oracle to SQL or go to the cloud, or you have new business rules that you have to implement like GDPR. That are the most difficult parts. So the maintainability and the flexibility is even worse if you have the traditional data warehousing without automation. So I think, and in the early days of my career, we had to explain why data warehouse automation is so important for people. I think everybody agrees that's the only way to do data warehousing at all. And that's what biGENIUS does. The traditional data warehousing, we automate it for you in a very nice way and efficient way. But we do more than that. biGENIUS has much more. And that has to do with, let me try the next slide again, with the whole automation for your, let's say, big data analytics platform. What you see on the screen right now is more the traditional data warehousing with the sources on the bottom and your BI on top. And the data warehousing used to be batch-driven, updated, and maybe today you have more need for event-driven or streaming data, and then technologies like Spark coming up. Or you can say that you will use the big data in the term of big volumes data, like metering and monitoring data. Which is very structured, but it can be a lot of data. Or you have the social media data, which is even unstructured. Well, that's not what you put in your SQL Server database. That's why you use your Hadoop platform, your file system for. And then once that's on Hadoop, let's call that the data lake for now, you are interchanging data from one place to another. And on top of that, you even have no SQL database, and then technologies like Kafka coming around. And with biGENIUS, we want to be your management console for the whole big data analytics platform that you have in place right now. make it flexible, make it standardized, easily to change from one place to another. You can start on-prem and go to the cloud, or vice versa. It's all maintained by that automation tool. And what I said before is the automation tool is based on the metadata. So we have a metadata repository. That also implies that versioning is easily available for you. If you're changing and modeling, and it's not, I need a new data warehouse, we close the shop for 2 years and then we'll back. That's not the way you can do business anymore. It should be agile, Scrum, DevOps, all that kind of nice terms has to be applied to your BI initiatives as well. So versioning, what was the exact definition when we run that report that we send to government is very important for auditing and governance and all of that. So what should be set up in your metadata repository? Different types of information. Here on the left side, you see that we need to apply to sources. Where's the data coming from? What type of data is it? So the source metadata. We do design the business. What is my business? What are my KPIs? What am I doing? What are relationships within my organization? And then you can design how you want to make it available. Do you want a data lake, or maybe star schemas, or a data vault, or a combination of that? That's something that you have to tell on metadata level, and then biGENIUS will all implement it for you. Of course, there's a nice UI that you can work with to edit and maintain all that metadata and put it in. And once you've done that, the data warehouse automation tool should do everything for your deployment, basically. It should create tables, create ETL tool, run it automatically, give you monitoring on top of your loading of the data. It will give you test automation, everything in place there. And even more, like a lot of services, meaning documentation. I have never seen in my career a project for data warehousing without data warehouse automation, where there was accurate, complete, and correct documentation all the time. Basically, there was no documentation at all. With a tool like biGENIUS, you have always the correct documentation for each version available. But also important things like data lineage, impact analysis, data profiling, all that things that are easily mistaken if you have to change your environment are done automatically by a tool of, like BReady. So it's taking care of the full life cycle of your data warehouse implementation, your big data analytics information based on that metadata repository. And that is how data warehouse automation should work today. That's how we work. And I think for now, that's enough background information. Let's hand over to Gregor to go into more the biGENIUS specific issues, the product description and demo.
Okay, Gert-Jan, thank you very much. So I will grab your mouse. So hopefully it now runs. First, I want to follow up at that slide with the metadata categories, because that's maybe very important to follow up with the demonstration. And one of the most important things inside our metadata repository is that we divide business model. On the left-hand side, you see the red circles. We divide the business model and the architecture and the implementation of the generation work. So based on that differentiation, we are able to define business models. You see one example, one easy example on the left-hand side, and use one of our generator configurations to generate all that physical stuff on the right-hand side. So what does that mean? On the left-hand side, you see the business model. And for example, if you have a generator configuration for relational modeling, for example, and this is generator configuration 1, and you use that kind of generator configuration, the generator will generate a relational model or a dimensional model, whatever the generator configuration consists, as a result of that. And if you want to switch to a data vault model, for example, you can switch to a second generator configuration. And inside that generator configuration, all that architecture aspects of data vault, for example, are configured. And then you can generate, based on your business model, the data vault physical implementation outside. Or other constellations, for example, if your generator configuration 3 supports Microsoft SQL Server technology, for example, and you want to switch to Oracle, for example, then you can switch to the last generator configuration, and you can switch from one technology to another technology. So this kind of concepts behind the metadata storage and dividing the business model and the physical implementation within the design patterns, that opens a huge flexibility for us to switch modeling techniques, to switch technologies, to enhance architectures in the direction of data lakes, for example, integrating event-based data integration and so on. So let me give a small example for that. So on the right-hand side, you see a more or less modern architecture of an analytical solution. And as you can see, the data integration from the sources to the first storage is only event-based, not based on batch integration, but based on event integration. And based on the left-hand model, we are able to generate all these different layers with different generator configurations. So in this case, we generate data integration based on Event Hub using Kafka or stream sets, for example. Then we store it, all the data inside a data lake based on Hadoop, for example. And on top of that Hadoop data lake, we are connecting with a traditional relational data warehouse to support all the reporting requirements on the right-hand side. So that might be one constellation in which we can support with different generator configuration based on one business or semantical model. And that's important to follow up with my presentation and the details of the demonstration, of the product demonstration. So let me give more detail on that point. I'm talking about semantic modeling or logical modeling. So on the bottom of that slide, you can see modeling objects, which are called source objects, stage objects, entities, facts, and mart objects, for example. This is a quite easy generator configuration for a traditional data warehouse structure based on a 4-layer structure, combining staging, cleansing, core, and data mart structures. And as you can see, the modeled entity is responsible for different layers in that architecture. So we model one entity, and this entity is the basis for generating the physical stuff on cleansing area, on core, and sometimes also on data mart. So we model once and use it 2 or 3 times via the generation based on the design patterns which are configured inside the generator configuration. So the generator configuration consists on modeling objects, as you can see on the bottom, and also on the physical implementation. And that's the point I will follow up also in my product demonstration. It's important to note that there is a difference between physical and modeling objects in this case. So based on our different generator configurations, we are able to combine different scenarios, for example. So if you want to go a more traditional way of data warehouse, you can use that typical staging area stuff inside the generator configuration, use dimensional, relational, or data vault modeling, for example, for the core layers, and different options also on the mart layers. But you also can support some data lake structures on the staging area, put in some operational data store, persisting data in the staging or in the operational data store, doing some historizations or also inside. So there are many different generator configurations available in the meantime, and you can combine different aspects on that slide, for example, to find the right solution for your requirements in your individual solution. So one further slide to explain that there are some different modeling approaches and modeling techniques which we support. So the first modeling approach is the business-driven modeling approach. So we're talking with the business guys and collecting some requirements there and defining some models. So it's a business-driven or model-driven approach. And in comparison to the data source-driven approach, you use the data structures from the sources, define based on the data structures of the sources your stages, and based on the stages the next level and the next level. So this is a bottom-up approach, and business-driven is a top-down approach coming from the business requirements. And we also support a third way of modeling. So it's similar like the business or the model-driven approach. Maybe we have some reference model from a similar industry, for example. We can use, or a similar use case, for example. We can use also predefined biGENIUS models to use them as a reference model and follow up with these best practices, for example, inside that reference model, and doing some business-driven modeling based on that best practices or blueprints. So we support more than one modeling approach, and the very important thing is that we are able to combine these things. So in many of the situations, we use the business-driven in combination with the data source-driven approach, because for the lower levels of the solution, it's easier to use the data source-driven approach, and for the upper areas of the solution, it's better to come from a business-driven approach and then combine that both things inside the mappings you have to define and generate all that stuff. And as I have already mentioned, we support dimensional, relational, and data vault modeling based on our generator configurations. So then this is a good time to step into the demonstration of the product. So let me step into biGENIUS. That's the home screen of biGENIUS, and as you can see in my sample metadata repository, I have different projects. And a little bit later, I will come back to that screen and explain why there are so many projects inside that metadata repository. But first, I want to do a walk through the application and show you the whole steps from defining a project and doing some setups of the project, and then start with integration of data sources, and start with modeling, either with business-driven or model-driven approaches, as well as data-driven approaches. And then I will generate all that stuff, deploy that stuff, and load test data inside. So then we have closed the circle from starting a project, modeling, generating, deploying, and loading with data. So I will use that project, which is called Sales Compact. That's a quite easy and small project to explain all that stuff. And I will step into that project and also open the modeling area. And on this screen, you will see on the left-hand side the Project Explorer, so the name of the project and the versioning behind. At the moment, I'm working in the work version, but I will explain what is where are the possibilities with versioning the metadata a little bit later. So I have that project, and I have prepared some environments for development, for example. So this is the environment for development. This is the environment for production. So behind the environments, there are some connections to that stuff behind those environments. So I have connections to the development stuff. I have connections to the production stuff as well. You can define as many environments as you want. You can add, for example, integration, testing, and so on, whatever you want. So, and what I have already prepared are some connected data sources. In this case, I have 4 connected data sources. I will show you one of that data sources. So this data source is called AW base, and there are some tables inside that data source. I will show you how it works inside the application. So there's a definition and the connection string behind that name to that data source, and we will have some discoveries. And discovering is one snapshot of the metadata of the data source at one time. So if I open, for example, that discovery, I will see I have read the structures of that data source, and I will open that table, for example, which is called subcategory. There are 3 attributes with that technical specifications and all that stuff. So I see all the things I have read from the data sources. And that's one basis I can model a little bit later with. So it's important to have that metadata from the data sources and have that discoveries, the different discoveries. So I can do different discoveries at any time I want. Because maybe the structures in the data source has changed, and then I can do a second discovery and compare the previous discovery with the second discovery, and I saw all the changes, and I can connect to the newer discoveries automatically. But for the modeling, it's important to select one of that discoveries as relevant for the further modeling, for example. And in this case, this discovery is marked as active, and this is responsible for a further modeling in this case. So yes, now I have some source structures. And now I can think about modeling. As I have already mentioned before, we can start with data-driven modeling, or we can start with business-driven modeling. So I will show you one example of the business-driven modeling. And for the business-driven modeling, I want to use the Dataverse object, which is called entity. And I will enter, for example, a customer entity, because it's always important to have reports about our customers. So I have generated or added one entity, which is called customer. This customer has at the moment no attributes because I haven't defined one. But it has already technical columns, which biGENIUS automatically generates in addition to a new entity. And these technical columns are used for the loading jobs, for the historization of the data, and so on. So this is done automatically by biGENIUS. And of course, this new entity has no relationships to other entities at the moment, and also no data flows and no data sources. So I can start with editing some additional attributes, for example. So I will add column which is called customer name, for example, and I will specify that column as n varchar with the length 100. So I have now modeled one attribute, for example. And in my sample case, I have not only that customer, but also some previous modeled objects, for example. So I can go further with modeling some additional entities in this way, for example, but there is also another way to do that, a more visual way, for example. So we can start with a model. Maybe it's better to understand the model, to have that already modeled objects inside that solution, and I can add also my customer inside that point, and maybe I can also model inside that visual thing, and I will add, for example, a fiscal period in this view. So now I have an additional entity which is called fiscal period, and maybe I want to do a relationship between the fact which is already modeled there, and create a relationship to the fiscal period and define that relationship. So that would be the approach to model, either on that more tabular mode, on adding entities in this way, and have a list of entities which are modeled from a business perspective, or I do that in that diagram mode, for example. So I will close that to follow up with the further things. So this was our two different approaches to do more business-driven or model-driven approach. But I can also support the source-driven approach, for example. So I have that pre-configured stage objects in my sample case, but I have no stage object for customer, for example. So, sorry, I had to do that panel on the right-hand side way, that I have more place for my modeling. So if I mark this source object, for example, I find a customer table in that source, and I can create a stage object based on that discovered source object. So if I press that button, I generate an additional customer object. So this is from the base source, and now I have that customer object, and based on that automatical wizard behind that process inside biGENIUS, I have all the terms or columns of that source table. The same way, biGENIUS automatically adds some technical column for the load processes, and also the source term mappings to that source terms from the source objects. So this is done automatically. For example, if I had, for example, so let's say in one source system 200 of that kind of source objects, I can mark all that source objects and say start stage objects, and all the work is done by biGENIUS itself. So that helps very much. And then I have done the work data source driven. So I mark the data source and generate all my stage stuff outside that point. So, and if I follow up that data source driven process, for example, I can now mark that object, that customer object, and say create an entity, for example, and then an entity will be created automatically as well. So I can do the data source driven step by step from bottom up, as well as I can combine, for example, my previous modeled custom object and define some data flows, for example. And now I have my stage object customer, and I can say, okay, create me a data flow from that stage object to my entity. Then I have created the data flow set, for example. So I had to put my panel on the right-hand side to show you more things. So then I have one column which I have edited manually. So this is maybe the customer name, and I had to map that customer column to that customer name, for example. And then I have done a simple mapping for that attributes. I can add additional term rules with some business logic, for example, or I can use some default values and many of that stuff on the right-hand side of that table to define more business logic inside that mapping. So, but I can also use some additional other valuable wizards. So if I mark, for example, a lot of that source table columns from the stage table, I can create also a lot of attributes inside automatically. And if I go back to my terms list, now you can see there is not only the customer name I have edited manually, I have also all that business attributes from the customer inside my mapping as well. So this is the combination of doing business-driven modeling and data source-driven modeling and map them together between entities and stage objects, for example. And I want to show you a little bit more complex example. So in that person entity, I have now opened, we can see the data lineage of that person entity. And this person entity is filled up by a lot of different stage objects. And the blue ones are source objects. So this is a more complicated mapping logic divided in different steps. And we like this differentiation in different steps and not doing all in one complicated SQL script, for example, because it enables you to have more traceability, to locate the failure easier if you have divided this in different steps, and you can see, okay, there's maybe there's an error in this step, and then you can locate it, this mapping, for example. And if I open that point, I can show you the mapping. So there are 3 different data sources, and for each data source you have different sets to fill with the logic. And as you can see, there are some term rules also inserted, and some business logic for that explanation. So if I have at the end of the day, maybe you have modeled a set of entities and a lot of stage and maybe stage composite objects, and maybe also some facts. And facts are looking similar like entities. They have columns, and inside that columns there are the KPIs you want to report, of course. And you have already also that technical default columns for the data load and the management of that. And of course, you have relationships to different entities to report all that structure. And you have the data flow sets and also the data source mappings, and maybe you want to use some aggregation types. There are a lot of also definable aggregation types inside such a entity or fact table, for example. So at the end of the day, maybe you have defined all your entities and facts you want to deploy to your solution or generate before deploying for your solution. So let me close all that tabs before I start with the next step, the generation. So first step was modeling, maybe based on data source driven or business driven, as I showed you. And after that step, you can follow up with the generation of that specific version. And inside that generation wizard, I have to select, for example, the environment for that I want to generate the scripts. I can validate the model before I generate it. So there are a lot of predefined validation rules which checks the model. And after the model checking, I get a result. Is the model okay for generating, or are there some errors, for example? And hopefully I got the answer in some seconds. Okay, I have, I see there are 2 errors at the end of the day. So I have an error with my customer entity and with my fiscal entity because they miss some business keys. So this is a validation rule which checks there are some problems with my model. So maybe I decide to generate it either. So I had to define a destination folder, and that's very important because biGENIUS generates scripts for the deployment. We don't connect directly to the data warehouse solution. We generate scripts, and these scripts are deployed by some batch files, for example, to the target environment. So let me start the generation process. And I decide to generate all that stuff I have modeled. And then the generator runs and run through all that modeling objects, use the description of these design patterns and generate all that stuff I have modeled based on the generator configuration and all the templates which are used behind. So now you can see that the cleansing area objects are generated. Now the data warehouse core objects are generated, and finally the data mart objects are generated, and hopefully it's finishing with success. So I'm lucky at that point. That means that the generation of the scripts works. And now I can open the destination folder, which is generated, and I can open the folder. So inside that destination folder, I have different folders as well, and I open the SQL folder, and within the SQL folder, you can find all the generated scripts. For example, there's a summarization script for staging, for cleansing, for core, and for the core data warehouse and the data mart structures. So let me open one example, for instance, the stage objects, so you can see the code which is generated is, I think, very readable. It's well documented. Each part of that script is documented, which template is responsible in which version to generate that code, and each step is divided in different sections. So you see that I think the code is very readable and very good documented at the end of the day. So let me close that and went back to the destination folder. So not only the SQL folder within the and the SQL scripts are generated, there is also a documentation folder, and inside the documentation folder, the documentation for that version I have generated is also generated. So I have a full documentation with different sections, and I can navigate to that section. So one of the most important things is that cross-reference. So there you can see the stage objects which are modeled and the usage of that stage objects from different entities, for example. The next level are the stage composite objects, which are and their usage, and then you can find all these entities. And I have shown you the data lineage of that person entity. If I step to that person entity, you can see all the description of that entity with all the attributes, for example, the relationships to other entities, the foreign keys and the source terms of the foreign keys, for example. Also a picture, a navigatable picture of that data lineage, for example. So you can step to different areas of your application and your model. Then we are in that stage composite objects. There you can see also the term rules and the business logic behind and all that stuff. So, and this is done for all that things we have modeled before, and there you can see some more sophisticated term rules, for example, inside the application. And this is done for everything which is modeled and which is used by the generator to generate that scripts. And yeah, there's a huge stuff behind that thing. So let me come back to that destination folder as well. There's a cert folder, and inside that cert folder you have some command files, and that command files will help you to do the next steps based on that generated scripts. For example, deploy it to your in this case to your development environment. So there's a deployment script which calls your different generator scripts. And so, of course, I have with my additional model some errors there. So hopefully the execution of the load job will work. So I start that point. Yeah, okay. So now I have started the load of the test data, for example. And yeah, and to show you more results, I will step back to a special script, and I will open that script in my local management studio to show you what is happening after the test load or via the test load. So there is a script which is calling all that data flows, for example, and start some kind of a execution lock. And the result of that execution lock will, so there are some errors based on my model. So maybe I will quit that entity and delete it. So I will also delete the fiscal entity and do the same stuff. Maybe I also quit that thing as well. Then hopefully I have a clear generation result based on my base demo model. So let me do that once again and start the model without that additional things. I'll open the destination folder, get to my deploy my solution. Yeah, that looks a little better. And let me do also the execution of the data load of the test data. So this is the last step to have feedback if the model is consistent, if the use cases of the test data are working. And now I can show you maybe the result of that script as well to give you an overview about the result of the load control monitoring. Yes, now I have the result as well of the load control monitoring. And as you can see, there is any load or is registered in that metadata stuff. And you can see all the results of the loads. So each load is successful, and you have to respond how many rows are loaded with that process, and also the dependency to other load processes are managed here. And if there is a failure, you get a good response for that, and see all that things you need for operating at the end of the day your solution. So this is now one step from starting a project, configuring data sources, modeling your objects, generating, deploying the objects, and start loading test data, for example. And then you have finished, for example, a first iteration. And I said I will come back to that versioning of the metadata. So maybe it's necessary to build a release version based on that work version, or even a history version to store a specific status of that metadata. So to explain that versioning concept, I will open again my slides. Maybe this is easier to understand with an version tree based on some previous release versions, for example. So when I'm working inside the modeling, I'm always working on the work version, and I can do a snapshot copy inside a release version or a history version of that status of the work version. So maybe I have some previous works on different release versions, so version 1 or 2, for example, and now I'm working already in, so let's say in version 5, for example, or later than 5, and I found a problem inside my release version 2. What can I do? I can step back to that release version 2, open that release version because the editing mode is closed for that version. I can open it in an intermediate version, resolve the error, generate a release version 2.1, for example, generate that stuff for that version, combine it with some kind of environments, generate that stuff, and generate it in my source code in my target destination folder. And what we are doing with that target destination folder is we integrate that destination folder, for example, in some source code control systems. Maybe you will use Subversion or Git or Team Foundation Server, whatever. The meaning of that destination folder is that you have all in. You have the documentation in, you have the model in, you have some additional files I don't show you at the moment, and then you have all the things which are needed for source control, for example. And on the other hand, you have the versioning of the metadata inside the application as well, and step back to some versions and branch some versions, and so this is very important to follow up with a life cycle to enhance your data warehouse solution and to enrich the solution with additional functionality in different steps and different versions, for example. So this was a first walkthrough to the application. And now I want to point out some important things. And if you are thinking about automation, it's very important to have flexibility inside your architecture you want to generate, because your architecture might have not 4 default layers, maybe you have 5 or 3, maybe you can combine it with different technologies and so on. So it's very important to have that flexibility to define different design patterns, different architectures, different naming convention, different assembly charts, and so on. So even you are able to define different modeling objects. I will come back to that point a little later. So, and the next thing which is very important is to do everything inside the modeling application, not doing changes outside the script, outside the application on top of the generated scripts, because then you lose the lifecycle features of the application. So if you think about that flexibility and doing everything inside the application, you should have a huge flexibility, and that's the point. I will come back to the application and show you where are the points of that flexibility. For example, as I've already mentioned, we have the design patterns behind the modeling objects. And if I open, for example, that modeling objects, you see there is a design pattern that based on that entity, some cleanse objects will be generated, some core objects will be generated, and also some data mart objects will be generated. If I step a little bit deeper, then you can see we call that point data warehouse part group and some data warehouse parts, and that TA stands for table, view, and loader. So for example, if I open that part, I will see a template, and in the upper area of the screen you will see the template for the view, for example. And if I parse that template with the person metadata, I get the result which is generated based on that template and based on that metadata. So as I have already showed you, there are a lot of features inside to model more complicated data flows with different term rules, for example. But even if this is not enough to model some specifics on your model, then you can change the logic inside your template as well. And you can do that in a duplicate of our factory templates, because our factory templates are release managed. So I define a version 2 of that template. I can open the template, and based on our time, I make some easygoing changes on that template. So maybe this is my own code. So hopefully you can imagine that this could be real SQL code, and if I generate that on person, for example, and deploy that, so I have an error on that template, so that's not the expected result. So
oh, Gregor, I can hear that you love talking about biGENIUS.
Yeah.
And
so
no surprise.
maybe I can follow up. So,
yeah.
This is an important point. Yeah. So this is the last way to give some flexibility inside that thing. And what you can do is now to link that specific template to that special entity. But maybe this is a template which you want to use for all the objects you have modeled. Then you can define that template as a default template, for example, for the views as well. Then you can select that individual template, so it is used for all the modeling objects as well. So you can map it to one specific entity or use it for all as a default template. So this is very important, and with this feature you can do everything in your mappings as you want. So, and as you can see inside that generator configuration, there is also a configuration for data vault, and maybe you can see that naming. There is a specific template for hubs, for links, for satellites as well. So that means that I have on the left-hand side my model, and I can switch to that specific implementation, and I will generate data vault model, for example. So that's one point of flexibility. And the second point I will mention at the end of the presentation is the generator configuration itself. So you as a user, or every user, can do some enhancements on the generator configuration, for example, and inside the generator configuration, I only give you an overview of that point because there are so many things that you can define. So in the area of the architecture, you can define different layerings. So you can see the stage, the cleanse, and the mart layers, and different other layers, for example. And inside the configuration, there are all the templates and so on. So this is the area where you can define all your specific generator logic for generating your individual contents as well. So let me close that string and come back to my slides. I will give you some examples for that event-based thing. So in this generator configuration, there is a modeling object which is called event. And for the event data integration, we model events. And based on these events, for example, the sample generator scripts are based on, in this case, on curl scripts to generate some JSON objects to integrate that in that Kafka stuff, for example. Or in this case, we generate some Apache Spark SQL templates to use that in a Spark environment, for example. So that are the flexibilities in that area. And just one more thing, and then I'm finished with the explanation of all that thing. So at the beginning, I mentioned that the home screen of biGENIUS, and we can model different projects, for example. We can do one project in one solution in one project, or we can divide a huge solution in different projects, for example. So, and if I open that thing, and this is a project for modeling common objects which are used in different other projects. So I have so 3 different entities in this case. And I can show you the linked objects from that project inside that project. So I can open the linked projects, and now I can see the common project is linked inside this project. And if I open the entities and open the linked objects, I see those 3 common objects. And this approach is very huge feature to support a huge solution divided in different areas, for example, divided in a data lake or an event-based data integration, or data mart in different data mart areas, and so on. So this is a real huge feature to be flexible and rich enough to support enterprise solutions. So now I think I'm finished with my content, and we can follow up with some questions maybe from the audience. So Irina, do you know, are there some questions from the audience?
Well, since we are kind of overdue, we suggest that we come back to the questions in person. Getjen, what do you say?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea because we're running out of time. I've already answered a couple of questions during the sessions in the chat format. We got questions. Yeah, we have questions about if it's all cloud available, and the answer is yes. We can run both biGENIUS and the solutions in the cloud or on premise or vice versa. You can change that over time. So I think that that's a very good value to have. Questions about competition, maybe we discuss that in more personal sessions as well. So then, well, there was one more question that might be interesting. If biGENIUS is used in enterprise-wide deployment already, and the answer simply is yes, we have a very large complex project run with biGENIUS, and we're happy to share all that information and references with you as well. So I think thank you all for your attention, that we can close down the session now. We will give you an update by email when the recordings are available, and contact you as well so that we can discuss if this is of any help for you and how we can work together. And Irina?
Yes,
Anything?
at this point, I would just all say thankful to you, to the presenters, Getian, Gregor, and also to those of you who attended the session and took the time to be with us today. I wish you a great rest of the day or the evening. I don't know where you are, and hope to see you and hear you in the next webinar live demo.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
all.
Bye.